Hi, this is Paul, and for my regular viewers, this is going to be a little something different. I am going to be talking about Synod, and the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church began this morning well, I guess I got up kind of early, but it began this morning quite early for those of us on West Coast time, began at Calvin University, and I'm going to be doing some talking about Synod, at least some of the things that I've seen. The first day is sort of a flurry of activity, and then it sort of goes quiet, and I'll talk about the structure of Synod and how this works. And let me first give a little background about why I'm doing this. In the summer of 2017, I was already sort of playing with YouTube a little bit. I've been doing the Freddie and Paul show. As I had said to a bunch of people, I'd been thinking about book writing, but I pretty much realized that if I had been writing books, probably not a lot of people would read them. And so I'd been playing with YouTube a little bit, and I decided in 2017 to do what I call the Synod post-game show. And it sounds a little flippant, and some people might be put off by this. But I remember as a small boy, when my father was a delegate to Synod and my grandparents lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I would go to Grand Rapids, and I remember once as a boy sitting in the gallery at the Fine Arts Center. Today it's called the Covenant Fine Arts Center. Then it was just the Fine Arts Center, and watching it and got quite bored quite quickly as a little boy, and my grandmother didn't like to sit still either, so she took my hand and we took a little walk around Calvin's campus, and I think the science building was fairly new then, and so I remember walking with her around the science building because she's giving her grandson a little way to stretch his legs. Of course, we had gone to Synod and gotten to the gallery so I could see my daddy down there on the Synod floor doing the Synod thing. So then in 2017, I thought, there's a lot going on in this Synod. I'll put a link to this video below. Already, I had been blogging for a number of years, and I hadn't really figured out how to do YouTube with slides and everything like that, so I actually sort of set up a computer, and it was the same kinds of things I do now as I did then. I blogged and I made this little video and I posted it, and I was looking at sort of the history of the Christian Reformed Church, assimilation into North America, some of the various elements in the Christian Reformed Church with respect to that, and doing this. Well, why do this at all? Another memory from childhood was growing up around the dinner table at my grandparents' house, either in Grand Rapids or Whitensville, Massachusetts, and listening to the conversation about the Christian Reformed Church. They would often talk about ministers in the Christian Reformed Church going here or going there. The Christian Reformed Church was sort of like a large family, and we all paid attention to each other. But as a little boy, I couldn't really understand a lot of it, but I wanted to. Now, as I've grown into a man and I'm a minister of the Christian Reformed Church, I notice that a lot of people don't understand what's going on, and that's absolutely natural. There even within ministers of the Christian Reformed Church, there are some who pay close and careful attention to this, and some who don't. Recently, I made a video about Andrew Kuyvenhoven's Burning the Wooden Shoes article that came out in November of 1980. I love history and I love the Christian Reformed Church, and so I pay attention to these things, and I want to help the Christian Reformed Church understand itself. And we are in a time and at a synod which will be quite consequential in all likelihood for the Christian Reformed Church. I was a delegate to last year's synod. My youngest son is graduating from college this year, so I didn't think it appropriate to stand as a delegate, and so others have gone from my classes. And last year, I couldn't do a lot of it. I did a couple of videos after Synod, which you can find on my channel. YouTube has playlists, and so if you go into the playlist on Christian Reformed churches, you'll find all of the videos that I've done over the last 5 years that relate to the Christian Reformed Church. So I want to help people understand Synod. Now, obviously, all of my comments are my own. They're from my own perspective. Put 4 or 5 Christian Reformed ministers in a room and you'll get 4 or 5 different perspectives. So that being said, whatever I say, your mileage may vary. But especially for people who are kind of interested in what's going on in the Christian Reformed Church, partly because this year the Christian Reformed Church is sort of participating in this great dispute that's going through the church in the West with respect to human sexuality and same-sex marriage. There's a lot of attention being paid to the Christian Reformed Church. It may very well be that the events of this synod cause a division in the Christian Reformed Church. We're going to have to talk about that along the way. So I thought maybe I'd give, just as I gave in 2017, a post-game show. I thought maybe via YouTube I could give a little bit of color commentary on what I see happening at Synod that maybe will help people to understand Synod a little better. And part of my job with this is, again, to provoke conversation. Far longer than my YouTube channel, I've had a blog. I started this particular iteration of the blog in 2007. I actually, even before that, noticed that the denomination never registered the domain crcna.com, and so earlier I actually registered that domain and had a blog and had some talk about the Christian Reformed Church. And then when I wandered into some more controversial territory, I got a letter from the Board of Trustees, basically a cease and desist, saying I had to relinquish the domain, which I was happy to do so. I was a little annoyed that the Christian Reformed Church wasn't sort of using the internet as much as it could to facilitate conversation. Before I started my YouTube channel, one of the things I was known for in blogging was trying to encourage the Christian Reformed Church into what I called confessional conversations, because I could see early on that the Christian Reformed Church was very much heading towards a division, that some very deep differences in approach to church, understanding scripture, were manifesting different minds and different orientations and different trajectories in the denomination. His voice calling in the wilderness for confessional conversation was heard by some, but nobody quite knew what to do with it. Last year at Synod, we had a confessional conversation, and I usually try not to give too many speeches on the Synod floor, but the one speech I very much did want to give was to point out that while Synod was really feeling itself sort of racked in travail in last year's Synod, I said, hey, we're having a confessional conversation. How can we do this, and how can we do this better? Now, just this morning, I posted a little earlier than I usually do, just so the East Coast people could have the video earlier. I posted a conversation that we had. Sean Baker had developed a way of encouraging pastors to speak with one another over the difficulties of this issue, and then we had a little video conversation where they reported on that meeting. And this, for me, is something I'm very interested in, because regardless of what happens to the Christian Reformed Church in the future, I want us to at least be able to speak productively and have productive conversations with each other with respect to what we're seeing, what we're feeling, our differences, so on and so forth. I made this little slide of what if there were in fact silos in the church, and here I sort of concocted with these new AI graphics engines a church inside a silo and with other smaller silos within it. I used that the thumbnail for this. But this is what I've looked for in terms of confessional conversations for the church, to help the church move into the future more productively by not speaking past each other, not always yelling at each other, not closing our ears to each other, but speaking to each other, and have the discerning the body as we have these conversations. I just, in fact, finished my rough draft for Sunday on that text from 1 Corinthians 11 about Christ's admonition to discern the body. Now, I've been making videos for the last 5 years exploring lots of different things. Last month, we had a conference in Crosspoint Christian Reformed Church in Chino, where we had, it wasn't a Christian Reformed conference, it was what I call an estuary conference. Over the last 5 years, I've been working with a number of people on a whole range of things. John Vervaeke's in there. He's a cognitive scientist from University of Toronto. Jonathan Peugeot is in there. He's an icon carver. All of this sort of downstream from what Jordan Peterson sort of broke open in 2017, which, there's a lot of political and culture war stuff. That's kind of over to the side. We're talking about how modernity is receding and how we are going to need to have better language in the modern space to talk about spirit and spiritual. We're very accustomed to talking about Synod as a body. And it's important to understand that Synod is an example of an extended body of multiple human beings around which there is a structure, there are boundaries. It has a consciousness, it has agency. This is a body at work. And this language we inherit, and it's absolutely the appropriate language. The difficulty that we have is sort of connecting it with the other kinds of bodies. Part of this, when we think about body, we think about our physical bodies. Of course, the Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians talks about the body of Christ. And part of what we've been working on in this space is to revive a sense of consciousness and language and how we can communicate with respect to these bodies. Many things I've used often the analogy of school spirit, because a school will have a spirit. And the principal, the student body, the cheerleaders, the football or basketball team, the teacher, the faculty body, many of these bodies are basically nested bodies, the way you have Russian nesting dolls. And the bodies have consciousness. The bodies have stories. They have boundaries. They have limitations. They have times. They have impact. And so part of the purpose of these is to apply a lot of what I've been doing over the last 5 years in this example of Synod and the Christian Reformed Church, hopefully to help us understand each other better and help us have a sense of, okay, what is a Synod? How does that function with respect to the Christian Reformed Church, with respect to the body of Christ? What is the body of Christ? We will often in the church realm, bring this language into our meetings, but part now with the recession of modernity, part of what we're going to have to do is figure out, again, how to reappropriate this language, use this language effectively as we not only try to do our work within these bodies, but also the Christian Reformed Church. There's a lot of history to this, some of which I'm sure I'll get some things wrong, and you can correct them in the comment section. If I might do some live streams, similar to what I've done on my channel with other things, one of the things I want to do with my channel is to continue to build community. My desire for confessional conversations is to help the Christian Reformed Church do better at being a body, to help Synod act better at being a body. Now, the body of Synod is not synonymous with the body of the Christian Reformed Church. In my second conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, this is a conversation I did with Jonathan 4 years ago, but just starting to get at some of this stuff and understanding what he was saying. A little bit later, Jonathan Peugeot would say something like, well, every human interaction sort of creates an angel. And a lot of us sort of pushed back on that language, but I sort of, an angel, I think that's a little bit confusing. We're going to get into those conversations more and more, I think. But it's very easy to talk about the spirit of a conversation, or the spirit of a committee, or the spirit of a committee meeting, or the spirit of a particular synod. And if I first say angel and say, no, that's not exactly right, but then I talk about a spirit, then suddenly that spirit has a little bit more instantiation because I've sort of put it next to the word angel. And Synod 2023 is going to have a particular spirit. I was at Synod 2022, and it had a particular spirit, and that spirit was a little bit distinct, a lot of commonality, but a little bit distinct from the spirit of the previous synods that I had been to. I was in the advisory committee in Synod 2023 that looked at the question of structure, and so that advisory committee also had its own spirit, and I thought the advisory committee had a healthy spirit. I think overall Synod 2022 had a fairly healthy spirit as well. There are some times when you have a meeting and it seems to have a very unhealthy spirit. Other times, meetings have a sweet spirit. There's a lot of differentiation between meetings and spirits and sort of sensing what's going on with this language and how we can talk about it. part of what I want to say right off the bat is because I am thousands of miles away and watching this via YouTube on a 20-minute delay, I do not have a sense of the spirit of the meeting as people who are there will have. And so after Synod, I'll probably talk to some of my friends who are at Synod and get their sense of it. Every individual's take of the spirit of the meeting will also be different. And that certainly was true of Synod 2022. After Synod, there was quite a bit of reaction, as I think there will be probably after this Synod, no matter what happens. So, but part of this is going to be to see to one degree or another if we can get a sense of its spirit and how it works. Now, one of the things about synods in the Christian Reformed Church, unlike something, let's say, like the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate or Canadian Parliament, Synod only exists within the confines of the meeting, let's say. Synod begins and Synod ends. Synod 2022 is one distinct thing. Synod 2023 is another distinct thing. And in the Church Order of the Christian Reformed Church, that's recognized, and there's some advantages to that and some disadvantages to that. It recognizes that every single synod is made up of different delegates, and all of those delegates will contribute to the spirit of that synod. But just like school spirit, whole other things will contribute to the spirit of each particular synod. The year, the politics, the fashion, the technology. One of the differences in this year's synod is it is being held in the chapel building at Calvin University. It used to be held in the Fine Arts Center. I've heard that the reason for this is cost. Now, the chapel is cheaper for Synod to rent out from Calvin than the Fine Arts Center. It's a smaller room. Now, some of you will say, well, doesn't the Christian Reformed Church own Calvin College? Yes, but it's not unusual to have, for budgetary reasons, to keep the money in the family, to have money exchange hands within the family so that Calvin College doesn't abuse Synod, and Synod doesn't abuse Calvin College. Synod can say, these are the services we pay for from the college. You should make good on your services. Not that Calvin needs that. Calvin is always a gracious host to Synod, does its best, and hopefully Synod is a gracious guest to Synod. But Synod pays for it, and the chapel is a little bit cheaper. As you can see from the pictures in the room, well, let's get a view out here. Oh, come on. There we go. The structure is the same. I think the chairs in the chapel are better than the chairs that they usually put up in the Fine Arts Center. I always call it the Fine Arts Center. I'm an old guy. I don't call it the CFAF. I call it the FAC. And some of you insiders will know what I mean by that. But here you have in the front of the building, in the front of the room, the head table, and you'll have the used to be the executive director, now the general secretary. Kathy Smith is the parliamentarian. You'll have the executive of Synod sit up there, and these are the delegates, and they're sitting by classis. A classis is a regional assembly, and each classis sends 4 delegates. There are also other delegates or advisors that go. You have visitors from other churches that have ecclesiastical relationships with the Christian Reformed Church. There are youth advisors. There are multicultural advisors. Past years, there have been female advisors. There was a discussion when Synod was open to female office bearers. That's, again, part of the conversation that this came in. You sit there, and a lot of the stuff now is done through laptops. And if you don't have a laptop, they will provide one for you. It's done through sort of Google Docs, Google Pages, the voting. They have little applications that run through there. You have screens in the room. There are PTZ cameras so that they can sort of watch it. One of the differences between the Fine Arts Center and the chapel is there is a lot less gallery seating in the chapel than there was in the Fine Arts Center. That's not necessarily a big deal. Most of Synod, there aren't a lot of viewers, and there are in fact fewer. There are both more viewers and less people in the gallery now that it is live streamed out via YouTube. People all around the country can watch it via YouTube and get a sense of it, and you don't have to go to watch it from the gallery. Now, the live stream is on a 20-minute delay, and that's important to note because they want people in the body, in the room, to have their consciousness focused and concentrated on the body itself, and to not have people texting in, oh, talk to this and make this speech or make this point or vote this way. With the advent of modern communication, all of that brought a new dimension to the body at Synod. And so in the last few years, they have worked hard at saying, if you're a Synod delegate, don't do social media, don't tweet things, don't read Twitter. They obviously can't necessarily have you not reading Twitter, but keep the consciousness of the body within the confines of the body. Now, Synod is a church assembly, and the Christian Reformed Church tries to balance, so you have local churches, you have regional church, that is the classis, and then you have the Synod, which is the binational church between U.S. and Canada. And the Christian Reformed Church tries to balance those. Basically, the Christian Reformed Church is a Protestant denomination. Says local church councils. Local church councils are sort of the foundation of the authority, and then it goes up from there. And actually, Christian Reformed Church polity tries to balance this dynamic up and down and back and forth. And what that means is that every synod is convened by a local Christian Reformed Church. And the Christian Reformed Church this year that is convening synod is Church of the Servant in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have friends who are in Church of the Servant. Church of the Servant is a church very near to Calvin College. It is it's a church with a very interesting history. In the 1960s and 70s, they were very much experimenting with liturgy. It's a very interesting congregation. I should bring someone from their church in and talk about the history of their church. They experimented with liturgy, but it was during the 60s and 70s, so it's had, in some ways, some countercultural vibes to it. So they were quite a bit more intentional and liturgical before that was really fashionable like it is now. But they also didn't own a building. They met in a gym. They did that for a number of years. There are a fair number of Calvin College faculty that were part of their congregation. A number of years ago, they decided to take the step of moving out of the school, the Christian school gym where they had been meeting, and to build their own building, which they did on, I can sort of show you how this lays out. So this is Google Maps of Calvin University. Now, I know for some of you, you're going to be like, I came here for Synod commentary, and I get all this historical background. Well, yes, that's true. You can always zip ahead through the miracle of YouTube to where you figure I'll start talking about the politics and all of that stuff. But all the politics, again, this body is nested in a lot of history, and that history is important. And for most of the watchers of my channel, many have sort of derived kind of an interesting fascination with this strange thing called the Christian Reformed Church. Now, let me zoom out. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, down here you see Holland, Michigan. This area was settled by Dutch immigrants in the 19th century. Holland, Michigan. Look at a bunch of the names of these towns. Noorderloos, Zeeland, Borculo. They took their names directly from the Netherlands. The migration that produced the Christian Reformed Church and a lot of the Reformed Church of America in this region Grand Rapids has sort of been the center of the Christian Reformed Church. Calvin College used to be up here. Let's see, there's Easttown, there's Wealthy Street. I've lived in these neighborhoods. There's Hall. Oh, they renamed Franklin to MLK Jr. Street. Oh, that's interesting. My parents went to Calvin College on the old campus. And in the Calvin in the old part of the city very quickly saw that it was growing. The baby boom was expanding the Christian Reformed Church, and there wasn't going to be enough room for the college. And so they got a hold of the Knollcrest farm, and they began to build first dorms here on the campus, and then more and more buildings. And eventually the college moved lock, stock, and barrel to the corner of Burton and the East Belt Line. A number of years ago, they got more land on the other side of the East Belt Line, and they have a nature preserve over there, and they have some ball fields. And I was talking about Church of the Servant. And when Church of the Servant built their church, they built it right next to, basically on the same block of Calvin. And as I said before, even before the church moved there, much of the church were Calvin faculty. They were deeply tied to the church. And that is the convening church of this synod. Well, what does that mean? Well, if we go back to, you see all of these people leading in worship. They are basically beginning the synod of the Christian Reformed Church with worship. And Church of the Servant also has a vibrant African immigrant and refugee program. And with this, they clearly have a number of Africans that are in the congregation, and so they are taking part in leading worship at Calvin and beginning the synod with that. And so the first while of the live stream, you will see they are going to be worshiping and in prayer. We're almost a half hour in. I forgot what. Okay, so Church of the Servant has two pastors, and so one pastor will usually give, or there'll usually be a admonition to synod. They went a little long today, and scheduling is a really big deal at a meeting like this because they've got a lot they've got to get in. Synod used to be 2 weeks, and now it's 1 week, and I'm sure there were plenty of. Personally, I think the church might still be served if they had 2 weeks and a little bit more leisure time and community building time, but that would limit the number of people who could come and, in fact, lose 2 whole weeks. So Synod now has 1 week.
But when we become stuck in that posture, we lose a positive sense of what we're for, and more importantly, of what God is for, and what the struggle we are in is ultimately for.
So there'll be a sermon, and there'll be some admonitions to the delegates about synod.
We hate in common is too often all the rage, and it also happens to be a very big business. Noticing what we love in common and studying that might help us survive. I don't know about your congregation, but Church of the Servant has had its own sorrows and struggles this past year. But we're serving here today for the sake of joy, the Lord's joy. It's the 50th anniversary of our congregation, our Jubilee year, an echo of that 50-year rhythm in the life of ancient Israel, the year of the Lord's favor, the Sabbath year of Sabbath years, the year when debts are canceled, when slaves are freed, when folks return to their homes, when property is returned. One way the Lord's Jubilee joy has arrived for us is in a house in the front of our church property, right here on Burton Street. We call it the Welcome Home. It's a refuge for newly arrived refugees. And while raising funds to purchase this home, our church happened to be hosting a blood drive, and we do this periodically. And a community member came in to donate blood, and he was speaking with a church member and asked how things were going.
There, I'll leave you with a cliffhanger. The link to this whole thing is below, so you can certainly catch the sermon, catch different parts of it. Now, that's one of the key differences in this, in terms of the body, is that when you're there, of course, you're there in person. There's the atmospherics. There's all the relationships. There's all the networks. It's a very different thing than watching it on a screen. If somebody made a comment on CRC Voices that synod's like kayfabe, there's this long periods of monotony and then moments of crisis and tension, and that very much is true about synod. It goes back and forth and back and forth. And when you're there for the whole thing. You're there for all the plenary sessions. Right now, they're in advisory team meetings. You're there for all the advisory team meetings. You're sleeping in the unair-conditioned dorms. You're eating the dining hall food, which isn't so bad, but it's not home cooking. You're sleeping in a bed that's probably not real terrific. You're separated from your church or your family, but you're there with new friends, building relationships. So it very much has a big part of body life. And again, it's important to recognize that you're there as part. A local church is convening it, so there's more worship. Usually worship goes about a half hour. They went quite a bit. They went a bit longer. And so there was talk about synod. You have the greetings from the president. There's a new president at Calvin University. And so he had never had a chance to greet them. He's the son of a missionary. Again, back to the video that I made. No, not that one. The denomination is a much more diverse place than it was when I was born almost 60 years ago. And those issues of diversity, so if you don't have sort of ethnic commonality that holds you together, what holds you together? Is it confessional unity? Is it something else? Is it something a little harder to put your finger on? Because all of what makes a body is usually we're not adequate to sort of describe it. Even our own physical bodies, where it's inadequate to finally describe a physical body as it is an ecclesiastical body or a spiritual body in terms of holding it together. Church of the Servant has co-pastors, and this pastor is Irish, and part of what's fun is listening to her Irish accent as she reads.
President of Calvin University, Dr. Wiebe Boer, who is going to welcome us formally and officially to the Calvin University campus. Welcome.
And Wiebe, part of Dutch last names. When you grow up in the Christian Reformed Church, you learn how to say Dutch last names because these are the names of the people that are around you. Now, it's interesting. You have Kathy Smith over at the end of the stage. Smith, not really a Dutch name, but she's the daughter of a former general secretary, a longtime general secretary, Leonard Hoffman, Dutch name. But not everybody here is so good with Dutch last names, and so every now and then they'll say one. But if you look around Synod floor too, there's a fair amount of diversity there in terms of people from other ethnic groups. I mean, it reflects America, and the Christian Reformed Church has gotten enormously more diverse in the last number of years. And again, the work of my father, my own storyline, the work of this church. That's been a big piece of the diversity that is now part of the Christian Reformed Church. And that diversity is, of course, both a blessing and sometimes a challenge. Now, this part is going to get a reaction from some of you.
We need to prepare for Synod. And this goes to exactly what Karen said about a couple of years ago. The Synod Review Task Force made a series of recommendations for improving how Synod would function in order to create a really healthy and the best possible environment and culture for Synod to conduct its deliberations. So, Synod, they noted, is a deliberative body. It's the broadest assembly of the CRC, whereby delegates from all over North America come together to listen to the variety of perspectives and insights and voices present. And in this conversation that you're going to be having over the course of this week, to discern the leading and the prompting of the Holy Spirit. So for Synod to work well, all delegates need to feel empowered and encouraged and supported to participate in the conversations that happen here, regardless of age or gender or ethnicity. We are one body with many parts, as Paul notes in 1 Corinthians 12. And we need all the parts of the body to participate and work well together if we are to flourish. And so to this end, Paul actually goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 12, now if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, and I do not belong, and it's not an ear, has
I'm going to plus to
different
this a little
spiritual
bit.
gifts that people bring, different made of the body.
But notice again all the body
Now,
language.
one of the reasons here are not sure.
This is what happens if I don't, prepare slides.
Delegates to better understand the power with which they are privileged, especially with regard to gender, ethnicity, position, and age. So the goal of this brief training this morning is to make us all attentive to and curious about each other and about what each of us has to contribute to the process of deliberation. And for those of you who feel like you belong, like these are your people, and who feel confident that your contributions and your words will be received well and carefully considered, we hope that you recognize especially that not everybody who comes here feels that way. And that despite Paul's clear teaching, there are those in our midst, even here this morning, who wonder whether they're really part of this body. So we want to equip you this morning with a simple framework, a mindset, you might say, that you can use to help you and this body live more fully into the vision of 1 Corinthians 12. And to do that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Sean.
So some of you might recognize Sean. So Sean got this duty, and I think this is well meant. I don't know whether how much progress you can really make on sort of helping the body function with this admonition, but that's now a part of every synod. And again, part of synod is they talk at you a lot at synod, and there's just a certain amount of presentations. There's not a lot of training things, but my guess is that this will go for a few years, and I doubt it will go on forever. But I listened to some of what Sean did. I thought he did a nice job. But it's difficult to sit in those chairs just hour after hour after hour, and if you can get up and sing, that kind of keeps you awake. But it's, yeah. So that's that. So some of you will be triggered by that, but from the HR departments that are making you do things. And then after that, let's jump ahead. Zach King is the general secretary of the denomination. That's that structural stuff that has been migrating. You might remember if you watched last year's synod that I had the privilege of doing the synod interview with him, and so he's serving in that capacity now. There's a little bit of training for using the voting system that comes in, and they first vote on flowers. And then they vote for officers, and And again, the convening, let's see if I don't want to jump into, I would find it here. Okay, now about officers of synod. Officers of synod have a role in helping the body function. That's their main role. They have a little bit of duties after synod. They become the program committee for the following year's synod, and the program committee helps with a bunch of details. That actually becomes a thing a little bit later on with this synod. But for the most part, their job is to help function. And there's a president, a vice president, a first clerk, and a second clerk. Now, in the days before you had staff and computers and recordings and all of that, it was the job of the clerk to take the minutes. And that would have been a big job in something like this. Now there's a tremendous amount of staff around who are recording things, and this whole thing has been systematized. I held up the agenda for synod in a previous live stream. It's a big book, and basically once they have the agenda set, well, that agenda basically goes to the advisory committees. The advisory committees bring things back to the floor. As I do more of these videos, you'll get a sense of how synod operates in that. You get a sense of pacing and everything that goes on. And part of, so now they're going to elect officers. Now I'm going to talk about body politics. And politics are always a part of a body. Politics are sort of the way that things function. Who gets selected for what role. Before synod, a list goes out. Basically, you get all these questionnaires if you're a synodical delegate. One of them is, would you be willing to serve as an officer, yes or no? I think most people say no. It's being an officer. Synod has its own rules, and there are, if you go to the Synod website, you can download the book of rules for Synod and read those if that's the kind of thing that interests you. But because Synod only happens once a year, and many of us only go to Synod a handful of times in our lifetime, most people are a little foggy on Synod rules. The Synod officers, especially the president and vice president, they're in charge of making sure the Synod rules are followed. The parliamentarian is there as well, and we'll get into that a little bit later because that will come in that discussion that we had on this first day. But people are going to make comments about the length of this video. Yeah, you had about 15 minutes of real synod action, and Vanderclay took 2 hours to talk about it. Yeah, typical for me. But people on my channel like this sort of thing, so you can always listen to it at 2x speed if you want to. So people then say yes or no whether or not they'd agree to be an officer. And then those lists go out. And the lists of all the delegates go out, and those who have agreed to stand for office are, in another form, they list how many synods they've gone to, what their roles have been at those other synods, what their roles have been denominationally, maybe on denominational boards, at classis, maybe on classical boards, in terms of running classis meetings. And the point of this is to try to give some assessment of competence, because the real business of the officers of synod is to facilitate this meeting as best they can to have the spirit work well, to have the spirit of the body work well, basically do for it to function. And that means knowing rules and procedures. They're working on synod while all the rest of the delegates in that sense are working in synod. And so experience is a really vital indicator. But experience is not the only thing, because of course there are factions of sorts in the Christian Reformed Church. There are, let's say, confessionalists. If you look at, I actually had a slide of this in my 2017 post-game show. There are confessionalists in Classis Minn Kota. We'll hear from them at this synod. They tend to emphasize the antithesis. The Reformed faith tries to balance the antithetical, which is black, white, right and wrong, and common grace, which is a little bit more analog. So you have the binary and the analog. So you have the confessionalists, and they tend to be the conservatives. You have the CRC evangelicals that are sort of like, they sort of have a common spirit with many evangelicals. The Christian Reformed Church is sort of assimilating into the other Christian spirits and cultures in North America. You have the progressives, and they tend to be more social justice oriented. Classic Grand Rapids East. This is 2017. And I'd talk about the emergent sacramentalists. They tend to be Church of the Servant. Are they progressive? Are they emergent sacramentalists? The sacramentalist faction is interesting in the CRC because some of them are fairly conservative and some of them are fairly progressive. And when I talked about the history of Church of the Servant, they sort of have both things going. And so the particular struggles within the Christian Reformed Church are really felt in a church like Church of the Servant. So you get the list of people who are running, and people are going to pick. Now, at Synod, maybe a year like this, you're going to have more people who are sort of politically motivated in the denomination. When my grandfathers were going to Synod, I think I'm going to hear from this because my mother's going to watch this. I think my mother's father only went to Synod once, if at all. And he had been an elder in his Christian Reformed church. But, in the middle of the 20th century and the early part of the 20th century, to be a delegate to Synod was a high honor. And, people bumped elbows to try to, be found worthy as climbing those status hierarchies and being delegated to Synod. These days, it can be tough to get enough for some classes, to get enough people who are willing to not go for 2 weeks. That was 2 weeks plus travel, in some cases before air transportation. Now it's 1 week with air transportation, paid by the denomination. You're housed by the denomination. You're fed by the denomination. And still some classes out of a much larger church have a more and more difficult time getting synodical delegates. And women are in ecclesiastical office, and so the pool is larger, but getting those delegates is more difficult. Some of the people in a synod year like this where there's controversy, there'll be more activists, let's say, on both sides of the aisle that are motivated to get to synod. But at every synod, probably the majority of people there are not politically astute in terms of the Christian Reformed Church. Yeah, they know that stuff is going on, but the level of interest that you are demonstrating by watching this video, the vast majority of those people do not have. They have their own experience with the Christian Reformed Church. They have their own set ideas about good, bad, right, and wrong. And they might not know hardly any ministers in the Christian Reformed Church beyond those in their own congregation, much less in their classes, much less in the denomination. And so there are different. The election of officers sort of tells you different things about the consciousness of the spirit of Synod and what's going on. Let's see where we're at here.
To be considered for Synod officers. So I'm going to read the names. We're going to start with the president and the vice president nominees, and then I'll also do clerk and second clerk. Now, there is some overlap. There are a number of the similar nominees. And also we have, like Karen was saying, we have a few that aren't here. So I will note that. So I'm going to begin with the president and vice president nominees. We have Richard Bodini. Richard, can you stand? Thank you. We have Ryan Brom. Ryan, can you stand? There's Ryan. Thank you. We have Paul DeVries. Paul, can you stand? There's Paul. We have Rita Klein.
Now I have to say that when I looked over who was going to Synod, I already knew who was going to be president. And he, in fact, is president of this Synod. Paul DeVries was a friend of mine in college and seminary. I only say these things to give you a sense of how the Christian Reformed Church is, especially among the clergy. Paul DeVries was a friend of mine in college and seminary. Paul grew up in the home I currently live in and own. His father was a minister of this church. He married a girl from Whitensville. And so there's lots of ties. One of his, I don't know if it was his first church or his second church, but it was Second CRC in Prospect Park. I'm trying to remember what we still call it. Sometimes some of us who have been in the Christian Reformed Church long enough still use the old names of churches. And so he lived in Prospect Park for a number of years. He eventually took Brookside Church in Grand Rapids, which, if I pull up the map, So here's Calvin University. If we go down to 28th Street, also called 11, and if we look at Kalamazoo Avenue, here are the offices. Let's see, we can bring in. Here are the offices of the Christian Reformed Church, and where's Brookside? It's pretty close here. His church is quite near there. His church is in Kentwood, which is this area here, and his church is in Classis Thornapple East. We all have reputations, and so people, if they want to challenge my characterization of where they fit on the political map, they can do so. Paul, I would say, is a moderate in the Christian Reformed Church. He's not a progressive. He's not a conservative. It obviously would have some conservative tendencies and some progressive tendencies, and a lot of this would depend on, well, if you agree with women in office, yada, yada, yada. So I'm just going to use rough categorizations. He's served many, many times in places. He's been the chair of the Board of Trustees. He's been the chair of the Council of Delegates. He's been chair of the Board of Calvin Seminary and a number of other boards. And so Paul has an extreme pedigree in the Christian Reformed Church in terms of serving at this level. And one of the things people look for, he's been president of one synod when I was there. Probably a few more times. And so there was no question in my mind that he would be elected to this office, because a bunch of people are going to look. He's been president of synod. People are anxious about how well the synod is going to go, so they're going to elect Paul. The other questions are going to be, okay, who else? Because you can sort of note the faction that these people are on. Now, again, most synodical deputies are not thinking in these terms. They're looking at a name. They don't know any of these people. They've served a number of times. They've been here. Maybe there's some predilection of they come from a conservative classis or a conservative part of the country, or a progressive part of the country, progressive classis. So there'll be some of that, but it's not strictly any of these things. It's a mixture of all of these things. So here are all the names that we're going to stand.
And Geltnick, Rita, could you stand? Thank you. Geltink, sorry.
See, struggling with those Dutch last names, Zachary King, who didn't grow up among the Dutch.
Thank you for that correction. We also have Timothy Kuperis. Timothy, thank you, over there. We have Chad Steenwick. Chad, thank you. We have Mary Stedjink. There's Mary right there. Thank you, Mary. We have David Struck.
David Struck grew up with me in New Jersey. Went to the same high school, as a year ahead of me.
There's David right there. Thank you.
Great guy.
Thank you, David. Elizabeth is not able to be here this morning, so we're removing her from the list. We have Scott Vanderplug. Thank you, Scott. And we have Steven Zwartz. Steve.
See what I said about tedium? You're sitting there and you're sitting through all these people have been sitting. They got the training. Worship, at least you can stand up and sing. You've got the sermon that sort of grabs you, but there's a lot of tedium to be a delegate to Synod.
Thank you. And we have John Canuster. John, thank you. All right, those are our candidates for president and vice president. Now I'm going to move on to the candidates for first.
Okay, and I'm going to speed this up because there is tedium and my time is limited. And here, especially with the first vote, this is the first time they had a little practice thing, but all the delegates are trying to figure out exactly how to work the machine and how it goes.
One still needing help and assistance. And I can tell you that we do not have a simple majority. The number of votes I'll read from the top down, and then I'll entertain a motion from the floor. 67, 41, 16, 15, 14.
Now, notice 67, 41. Now, I don't know which one it is, but right away, hearing who was voting, I knew right away Paul has 67, Chad has 41, and then the rest were small numbers. And they're going to vote between them, and Paul is going to be elected. Now, then they vote for vice president, and if you go to the Synod live blog, Synod has a variety of things going on right now. You can go to the live blog and you can see basically everything that happened during the day. Zachary King was is the general secretary. So Chad Steenwyk is the vice president. Chad is part of the Abide organization, and so that's part of what people are watching. So that's the conservative group that's been that's I've talked about Abide quite a bit. Henry Cranenberg, another Canadian, is serving as clerk, and Richard Bodini, Voicer, is second clerk. Now, what's interesting this year is that last year, it's become in the last number of years sort of practice that they try to have representation on the officers. And so they'll usually when people are looking for president, they're looking for someone with a lot of Synod experience, and especially someone who's had experience as an officer of Synod, because that's really useful. They usually try to get a female delegate. They usually try to make sure they have a Canadian representative, and they usually try to make sure that they have a representative that doesn't have a Dutch background or last name. Last year it was interesting because the president was a Hispanic gentleman, a conservative man from Classis, Arizona, and the vice president was from the Abide group, and the first treasurer or the first secretary was another person from the Abide group who was up for secretary again and didn't get elected this time. And then the final person was a woman from my classes who was a deacon delegate. And so they were able to sort of fill that out, except they didn't have a Canadian last year. This time, you don't have any women in the officer corps. You don't have any people from non-Dutch backgrounds in the officers, and you have two Canadians. Richard Bodini has made some noises with respect to his position on some issues in certain forums, but I don't know how many delegates would have known that. Richard was on for a number of things. Richard's been a minister in the Christian Reformed Church for quite a few years, but Aaron Vriesma was not elected in. And so some people are looking at that and saying, well, maybe this Synod is a little bit more moderate because Paul is a moderate, Chad is from the Abide group. Henry Cranenberg has been around the denomination for a while. He's another Canadian, fairly well known as sort of a academic. He's often been on the education committee, I'll say it that way. When I was secretary of the education or the missions committee, I remember one Synod I was secretary of the advisory committee, and he had some critique for my work, which was absolutely fine, Henry, if you're watching this. So it's an interesting mix. It's much more sort of a conservative to moderate executive that we have at this Synod. So again, part of watching Synod is to get a sense of where's the body at. You learn something by seeing who was elected to the chair, but it doesn't tell you everything. You still have to go through and see what comes. Okay, so that takes a while, and that's basically what I saw from the election, that I wasn't in any way surprised that Paul was elected, and I'm really happy he is. He's got a tremendous amount of experience at this. He's a moderate in the denomination. He's going to be fair. And right away, things were tested today. But I think if I was at Synod, I would have voted for him for president, because he's got a lot of experience for this. He's going to handle the meeting well. One of the things, he's had some health issues in the past, and that has affected his hearing. And that does in some ways impact the chair, because there's a lot of voice votes and you have to sort of listen. But he'll have the other executives there, and if a voice vote is close, they'll look at each other. And if you can avoid electronic vote, it just saves time. If it's really close, then they will go to an electronic vote. But that'll be something that you'll see as this gets going, because The difficulty with hearing will sometimes mean, well, actually, it'll help the live stream because he will make everyone talk into the mic, speak loudly, speak clearly, and that will help us hear it. When you watch Synod, you'll notice that they go for a while, and then they break. And then the real question is, okay, you take a break. You got to get people back from the break. You want the break to be just long enough so people get a chance to get out of those chairs and stretch and go to the bathroom and get a cup of coffee. Synod runs on caffeine, fat, and sugar. Because what you really need is a whole population of people my age who just need more caffeine, fat, and sugar, right? But the recent years they've tried to have healthy snacks, so they have fruit and water and all of those things. But if you want caffeine, fat, and sugar, plenty of it will be available during breaks. So then there'll be these long breaks, and Synod will sort of put forward this thing, and they'll go away, and then they'll come back, and then they'll begin to gather again. And I'm just going to shoot ahead to there was a lot of, so that's Paul. There's a lot of question about, will the seating of everyone go smoothly? Because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, what Synod 2022 did was sort of nail down the confessionality of certain beliefs with respect to same-sex marriage. And as, again, the videos and the conversations have gone about, what about gravamen? And, in other words, can everybody be seated there? And there has been at least one classis that didn't require for their meeting that everyone there at that classis sign the form of subscription. That classis sent delegates to Synod, and so what that opened up was a question: are those delegates actually properly seated? And so I and a few others wondered if we were going to have basically a credential fight about seating certain classes at this Synod. Now, the way it works is, and I had this wrong actually in previous, the way it works, so Paul takes over. Let's give you a sense of Paul. Again, exactly the right guy to lead this Synod, in my opinion. Still not.
Short passage from Scripture.
And there's Richard Bodini. He's a friend of mine from Voices. A view from the camera behind, he wore shorts. It's often you often get a little lecture at Synod to, business casual, please, because everybody's mom is watching, and you don't want to be seen at Synod. And Richard was there in shorts. And another friend of mine, I noticed he's going a little bald. I could see on the top of his head. And I'll call out some of my friends during this. So Henry Cranenberg is standing next to him. Chad Steenwyk is there. He'll be coming up. And this is Paul DeVries. Again, this is Zachary King, the General Secretary.
Earlier this morning, this was a verse in my own personal devotions. It came up in the reading. It's from Lamentations 3, verse 24. And when I saw Lamentations 3, I said, oh, I know the one that's going to be. But it's not the great is thy faithfulness, new every morning. It's right after that. Lamentations 3:24 says, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. So my encouragement to you this Synod is to remember that the Lord is our portion. Our position is not our portion. Our right to speak is not our portion. Our unhappiness is not our portion. Our frustration is not our portion. The Lord is our portion. And in my experience, that often means waiting. And with the waiting comes the listening, the thinking, the reflecting. So the Lord is our portion. Delegates to Synod 2023, it's a little unusual for us to be coming back after break. Usually we go right into committees, but we have to make sure we are ready for that. So please bear with us. Part of the reason I say that is normally you break and we officers all receive some training into how to do our jobs. So I just remind you, we haven't had any training on how to do our jobs. So bear with us.
But again, Paul has been doing this for years, so he doesn't need a lot of training. The other officers will pick it up as they go along. The president is most essential, and the vice president second.
That includes some of the technical training of speaker lists and the rest, so bear with us. And then I'd like to remind us of this, a note that I received. About a dozen people prayed for us in this space on Thursday. And the prayer was that God will equip you with his wisdom, his humility, his peace, his surrender, and unity as you do your work here and as we continue to do ours at home. So that's on behalf of our prayer shepherd, John Hookema. We're grateful. We're grateful for that. So know that we are being prayed over. I have a series of announcements that we need to go through, to go over at this time, to make sure we're ready to move forward with our work. And first, if you've been following along with the prayers of the Christian Reformed Church of North America, you might know that our theme comes from Philippians 2, verse 5. We've already been reminded of that. It says, in your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. So as we begin Synod 2023, our deliberations and discussions have been bathed in prayer, but we have difficult issues ahead of us, issues on which people disagree passionately. At the beginning of Synod 2023, we need to reflect how we will give honor and glory to Christ in our relationships this week. We've already been called to joy, so let's be joyful, celebrative. In disagreements, we speak the truth, full of grace. How does it go? Up and to the right, up and to the right. Over and over again, up and to the right, as Sean was reminding us. As officers of Synod, we're deeply committed to promoting Christ-like deliberation. None of us here are here to win or lose a controversy. We are here to follow Christ obediently into the challenges and opportunities that face the church. So we trust that you will encourage and exhort each other to this end. As officers, we are available to address difficult issues as they arise. So as we gather here to do the work of Synod, your work is being supported by many on your denominational staff, many in the churches, and I do want to give a shout out and a thanks to the staff that give me announcements to read when I don't know what else to do, that will help train us. Next to those who have been to Synod before, and those of us who have been to Synod many times, the staff comes here year after year after year after year, and we're very grateful for the wisdom that they bring as we come together today. So, having said all of that, the first item of business, and there are a number of them here, is I need to read the public declaration of agreement with beliefs of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. This is published at the end of the rules for synodical procedures. And what I'd like to do is ask all of you to rise, and then I will read this.
And again, this is usually very pro forma, and the question is everybody going to rise? Is someone going to challenge the chair? What's going to happen here?
Please remain standing. It indicates your agreement with those rules. Zach, can you have them in front of you, Zach? It says they're attached to my announcements. Thank you. We are assembled as delegates to the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church in North America to deliberate and decide on the issues here presented as Synod's agenda. We promise to do the work in obedience to the revealed will of our Lord Jesus Christ and in full agreement with what the congregations of the Christian Reformed Church in North America confess. We believe that the Old and the New Testament are the Word, the inspired Word of God, the only infallible rule for faith and life. We affirm three creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed, as ecumenical expressions of the Christian faith. We also affirm three confessions, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort, as historic Reformed expressions of the Christian faith whose doctrines fully agree with the Word of God. Along with these historic creeds and confessions, we recognize the witness of our world belongs to God, a contemporary testimony adopted by Synod as a current Reformed expression of the Christian faith. As we deliberate and make decisions consistent with these beliefs to the best of our ability and with the help of the Holy Spirit, we promise to seek the unity and the well-being of the Church of Jesus Christ, who prayed that all his own may be one in them. I ask all of you now who are standing and our delegates to express your assent by together saying, Amen. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated.
I breathed a sigh of relief when that was over, but we had a little bit more to do. So the program committee, which is done by the officers from the previous year, has to be approved. And someone from Classis Minn Kota stood up at one point and said he wanted to talk about it, but it has to be done after it's approved. Okay. And there's always a little bit of, okay, what do we do now? What do we do now? What do we do now? And I'm going to jump ahead to it.
Chair, my motion is contingent upon the program committee report, so it might be wise to accept that.
See what I mean? If they don't speak into the mic, we're not going to hear out here in YouTube land.
I'm sorry, first identify yourself with the name, the classes you're from, and then I was having trouble hearing you, so repeat what your suggestion was.
Sure, my name is Chad Rowan. I am a delegate from Classis Minn Kota. My motion that I have is contingent upon the program committee report making the advisory committees actually exist. So it would be beneficial to accept that report first before I bring this motion.
Okay, so I'm going to zip ahead a little bit.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Chad Rowan, Classis Minn Kota. Our motion is this, that Synod immediately be recessed and instructions given to Advisory Committee 8 to review overtures 62, 63, 66, and 67, and that Synod reconvene in plenary session no later than 4 o'clock this afternoon to hear and take action on the Advisory Committee's recommendations. We have two grounds. Number one, our unity as a denomination greatly depends upon maintaining the integrity of this body. As we begin Synod 2023, it is of utmost importance that we solidify the trust that our polity depends upon. Regrettably, credible reports have surfaced regarding a classis that may have violated church order and synodical procedures in selecting.
Just pointing out my friend Ren just to his left. Ren, when I got here at Living Stones, was a member here, moved back to Grand Rapids to teach at Calvin. Lost a great member. He's an elder from another church.
Their delegates, and concern that another classis disregarded settled and binding disciplinary instructions from Synod 2022. These actions compromise our unity and our mutual trust. Ground number two. In order for the reasonable and important remedies that these overtures request to be meaningful, Synod must consider them before conducting any other business. Immediately recessing Synod to allow the advisory committee to make recommendations on these particular overtures and report back in a timely fashion is well within Synod's established rules and procedures. To be good stewards of the time that we have, other advisory committees could meet during this recess to begin reviewing their materials with the understanding that no action be taken until after Synod reconvenes. That's the motion that we have entered. Thank you.
So basically what this would do is, so what happens at Synod is everything goes to these advisory committees. These advisory committees bring things to the floor as recommendations, and the floor acts on the recommendations. The advisory committees sort of pre-chew everything, and they're basically made up of a sample from the Synod, and most of the time Synod adopts what the advisory committee recommends. Sometimes they tinker with it a little bit, but they adopt it. There were some overtures this year that basically challenged the seating of certain classes at Synod, and the idea would be If the advisory committee could rule on that, those classes could be unseated at this point, potentially. But obviously, this is sort of a break in established procedure. So they made this motion, and now the question is, okay, what happens next?
All right, so just so the body understands, and to make sure I understand as your president, the motion is for us to recess from this plenary session immediately, to have Committee 8 consider these overtures, to come back no later than 4, to consider the objections to those who are seated, as you can have previously read in the overtures. That's sort of the heart of the matter. I'm going to rule that motion out of order on the grounds that Synod goes to all of its committees first. The committees do their work, and if the committees come back and respond in a certain way to those overtures, this whole body needs to discuss that and to discern that before it would change the way Synod is constituted. There's no current procedure for objecting to a committee that the program committee has assigned, especially once we've already approved the committee report. So it seems to me the best order would be to let Committee 8 do their work along with all the rest of the committees, and if a new rule is established for subsequent synods, so be it. That's up to us as a body. But I think it would be poor order for us to break now. I know that's a rather lengthy explanation, but I'm going to rule that that motion is out of order.
And a chair can do that. A chair can do that. Now the chair is going to be challenged. And so while this idea isn't technically illegal, Synod has the liberty to do as this motion requests. Synod doesn't have to. And so basically what we're going to see in the challenge of the chair is probably a sense of whether or not the vote will be sustained. Now he's pleading his case, but he's not talking into the mic.
For a slight adjustment in the timing of how we do things.
Or the mic is off.
And that timing is critical to making the remedies that are in those overtures meaningful.
Thank you. Please always use the mic when you speak, especially for the folks that will be listening. But the chair,
as opposed to those who won't be listening,
has been challenged. So I'm immediately going to step aside. Chad's going to take the chair. He'll explain how this works.
I thought I was going to get a little more time to rest than that. No, as a chair, when a chair is challenged, the vice president takes over as the chair of the body. Now, we will vote yes if we think the chair was right in his ruling. We will vote no if we think that he is not correct in his ruling. Now, this is a debatable matter, so we can have discussion on this. Are there any speakers in the queue? Okay, so the queue is just getting set up. We'll receive a second from the challenge. What's the point of order?
Challenging the chair is not debatable, if I'm correct.
The rules, synodical procedures say it is debatable. I will grab the paper here. All right, this way we're all on the same page. Concerning a ruling of the chair, challenge the chair. If any member is not satisfied with the ruling of the president, the matter is referred to Synod for decision. An objection to a ruling of the chair must be seconded in order to be considered and debated, so we do need to do that. The president presiding at the time of the chair shall relinquish the chair until the body votes whether to sustain the ruling in question. So it does say considered and debated. So is there a second to that challenge of the chair? Okay. If you could make your way, if you are in the speaker queue, and so the next up will be Heather Strobosher from Classis Grand Rapids North. So Heather, if you could make your way to the other mic, one of the other mics.
Thank you. My name is Philip Fritchley from Classis, Arizona. I am on Committee 8, and I understand the reason for the recommendation. I personally do not agree. I think we need to do what the chair said we need to do and let all the committees do their work. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather. Then we have Daniel Myers from Classis Ontario Southwest next up.
Heather Strobosher from Classis Grand Rapids North. This is new to many of us, and I would like to hear from our parliamentarian on exactly what our synodical procedures are on this matter. And you can fill it out for us, please, Kathy.
Now, you're going to see this fairly often because people are going to ask advice of the parliamentarian. Sometimes they're going to look to the parliamentarian to rescue them from something happening that they don't want. Kathy, I think, is going to be very cautious to stick to the rules and let Synod decide. Now, this, as you see already with this, the Christian Reformed Church is a very young denomination. You might say, oh, almost 175 years old, is that young? Well, for a church it is. And its rules, although they have their roots back in the Dutch Reformed Church going back centuries, the CRC continues to tinker with its rules. And so you're going to find procedures that come up that it doesn't really fit in the rules. And generally speaking, Synod can do what it wants. Synod has a tremendous amount of power within itself to do what it wants. And so it can change the rules. And one of the interesting things about the Synod is going to be, well, what are the rules? I mean, the gravamen, there's a long conversation about that. There's a lot of conversations about a lot of these things because the rules aren't necessarily that old or set in stone, and there's not that many rules.
Kathy, please.
Well, frankly, this motion that was made that has now been challenged, the ruling of the president has been challenged. This motion was new to me as well. So I'm not quite sure what your question is, but it is true that our president has ruled the motion out of order for the reasons that he gave, and therefore what the body has to decide is whether or not to sustain the chair's ruling.
So I'll make a clarification here. What we are voting on and discussing right now is the challenge to the chair. We're not discussing the motion. So if you're discussing the motion, I invite you to take your name out of the queue, because if we would sustain the chair, then that motion will go away. If we would vote no, if that would be the majority, then we will have the opportunity to debate that motion. But right now, we're not debating the motion in question. So to the motion.
But yet everybody knows this is going to tell us something about whether or not the motion is going to pass. And so there's, within the hearts of the delegates, they sort of want to well up and they want to argue about the motion, even though this is just to challenge the chair. But effectively, if you say, yes, the chair is correct, then the motion goes away. So it is and it isn't, but the vice chair is correct.
Motion or to the challenge of the chair?
If I can, I'll ask for your clarity whether my thing is to the motion or to the challenge. My question is to ask our parliamentarian whether there's any historical precedent for this sort of activity, or the request that has been made.
That's a fair request. I think, do we have any historical precedent of this that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
See, she was very brief. Just because in a synod like this, there's a lot of temptation to have the parliamentarian either make a case, basically get your thing done. And so she's going to be very careful here to, try and stick within it. And yeah, this is a totally new move, but obviously was planned before Synod, because I don't think they really typed that little thing out during the things that were happening before. This was the move that they planned to come. And that's not a bad thing. There's procedure. This is a body. There's a political element and layer to the body, but it all has to be held in tension.
Any other names in the queue? We have Todd Ritzma from Classis Grand Rapids North. Speaking to the challenge of the chair.
I'd like to call the question. We should on this.
I think we're there good. Thank you for that, because we have no other speakers in the queue. So, appreciate that though. That is always an option. To be clear, vote yes to sustain our president and his ruling that motion is out of order. You vote no if you disagree with his ruling. All right, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Aye. I judge that it passes, and so that the chair is sustained.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. Just a word about challenges to the chair. Challenges to the chair are simply when you think I've made a procedural mistake or I've gotten something wrong. There's no offense to it. Please feel free to challenge the chair. You don't need to feel badly about it. My feelings won't be hurt. We'll make lots of judgment calls together. Some of them will be close, some of them won't be close. So again, feel free to challenge the chair whenever is necessary. I know the very first time I went to Senate, it seemed wrong. It's not wrong. It's just a parliamentary way of saying, no, I think not. I think we could do it a better and different way. So just keep that in mind. We have approved our program committee.
And then they're going to adjourn for now. And what they're going to do then is they go into their advisory committees. And so there won't be any news for a little while. So the rest of Friday, they're in advisory committees. Saturday, they're in advisory committees. Sunday is worship service and some other things. And then Monday morning, then they start getting into plenary sessions. But the first day plenary sessions, they don't do a lot of stuff. The advisory committees at that point, some of them will be done, those that have the easier things. The advisory committees with the heavier matters will continue to work into the week, and their items will likely come out Wednesday and Thursday, and Synod ends at 3 p.m. on Thursday. So the job of the chair is to you get a sense of Paul. He's comfortable in the position. He keeps a good mood in the body, and we'll see how this goes. So I plan on doing more of these. I hope they are helpful. Leave a comment that lets me know whether or not you think they're helpful. Those of you who are unfamiliar with YouTube comments, if you decide to read them, be prepared to read people's opinions on a whole range of things, and people will state their opinions strongly. And if that really bothers you, best not to read the comments, because that's what people do in comments. It doesn't bother me. I'm sort of like Paul. Everybody has the opinions, and you're going to do with them what you want. But let me know if this has been helpful. I do this in the spirit of, yes, you getting my opinions in it. My opinions can be wrong. You might disagree with my opinions. And if you disagree with my opinions, feel free to do a comment. I'm going to do a live stream today. We'll see how that goes. We'll see if I do some more of those. The reason I'm not at Synod partly is because I have a son graduating, and so Wednesday and Thursday are going to be the big days at Synod. There are also days that I'll have to see what internet access is like in the place that I'm going, where my son is graduating. So we will see what comes. In any case, thank you for your time and attention, and I hope this was helpful. Leave a comment.